Welcome to Dairy Pod, a podcast series from Dairy Australia. Featuring a range of experts, each episode offers insights into Australia's unique dairy farming conditions, as well as personal experiences and the latest in dairy innovation.
Welcome to Dairy Pod. Hi, I'm Meghan Lodwick from the Gardiner Foundation. Gardiner is a self-sustaining philanthropic organization. Our vision is vibrant, thriving Victorian dairy communities where people want to live, work, and invest. One of our investments is the Wellbeing Index Project. Worldwide, many nations and organizations are now measuring social progress using metrics beyond economic growth, recognizing that it alone doesn't ensure a good quality of life. However, there's often limited information on quality of life, especially in rural and remote regions. Since 2013, the Regional Wellbeing team at the University of Canberra has surveyed Australians in remote, rural, and urban areas about community livability, resilience, and well-being. The team also specifically researched farmer resilience, a crucial component for the future of Australian agriculture. Our guest today is Professor Jacki Schirmer, who leads this research and recently presented her findings in Victoria's dairy regions. Welcome, Jacki, and thanks for joining me today.
Thanks, Megan, and I'm really excited to be here today.
Before we get into it, can you please tell us a little bit about yourself and why you started researching well-being and farmer resilience?
A little bit about myself. So I am a researcher at the University of Canberra, and I actually never intended to get into wellbeing and resilience research. So I kind of landed in it through a journey where I've been doing work with rural communities throughout my career, and a lot of it's been focused on people who work in natural resource industries like agriculture or fishing or forestry. Mm-hmm. And we kept on doing projects where there was a lot of change happening in those industries, and it was often change where people were really worried about what does this mean for the community? Will this change the future of our community? How can we support the future of people who've suddenly had a massive change to an industry they've worked in all their life? Mm. And we realised that we needed to look at those projects by understanding how quality of life changed, what were the factors that helped people adapt really successfully or not, and that brought us into this field of well-being and resilience. And all of that was sort of happening at the same time that worldwide we've seen this big shift from the idea that a community's future is all about its economic growth to an idea that it is about that. It's definitely about economic growth, but it's about a lot more than that as well. So for a community to do really well into its long-term future, it needs to provide a really good quality of life for the people who live in it, as well as the jobs. So jobs alone isn't enough, I guess, was the key message. And since then, we started our survey and we've been learning lots with lots of different research partners, and that brought us to today.
Yeah, 11 years of research. You'd certainly a lot would fall out of that. So I guess, what are some of the kind of key learnings that you've come across over those years?
Yeah, so what we did was back in 2013, we did start the Regional Wellbeing Survey, and that's a nationwide survey that looks at wellbeing and quality of life in rural regions in particular. And we started that because we realised that a lot of the data that gets collected across Australia, we've got so many surveys. I know everyone's sick of being surveyed, but the reality is that unfortunately a lot of those surveys focus mostly on city areas in Australia, and we didn't have a good picture of what was going on outside the cities. So we started the Regional Wellbeing Survey, and over 11 years we've got these really nice big samples of people. I'm a researcher, so I get really excited about big samples.
Fair enough.
and what it's been able to let us do is really demonstrate just how diverse rural Australia is. So probably the first big research finding, which comes as no surprise to any rural Australian, is that we've got this huge diversity in rural communities. Wellbeing's really good in some of our rural communities. Frankly, unfortunately, it's pretty low in some others. We've got really different things contributing to that. So we've got some communities where they've got this amazing natural amenities. So think about some of our coastal communities, some of our inland ones with these amazing river corridors. People absolutely love living in them. But in one community, you might have a concern about high rates of crime and safety. In another one, you might have experienced declining jobs in a key industry. So people love living there, but they're really worried about, will there be a future, or will the young people come back? So we're seeing a lot of variation over time. And we're also being able, through our research, to really challenge some of those common assumptions. You get these rural myths about rural wellbeing. And I guess a bit of a part of what we've been doing is sometimes busting a few of those myths. So, the classic one is, you will often hear people say, oh, people are happier if they live in rural communities. Rural people are happier than city people. To a limited degree, that's true, but it really depends. So we need to be really careful about making these blanket claims, because actually what we've seen over 11 years, the cities have kind of been catching up. So a lot of our urban areas, they've been investing in, really nice parks, improving some of the social connectivity, and they've managed to improve some of the things that were making wellbeing a bit lower for a lot of urban people. And in rural areas, we haven't necessarily been doing that in all of our rural communities. So we're actually seeing a narrowing of the gap, where there's still pretty high wellbeing in a lot of rural communities, not all of them. But there's less and less of a difference between urban and rural over time.
Yeah, that's interesting. What about dairy regions? Are there any kind of key indicators in those regions?
Yeah, look, again, dairy's really similar to everyone else in that dairy operates in some really diverse communities.
Yeah.
So when we look at dairy communities, we've had a really deep dive into this and looked at what are the communities where you've got more of your jobs depending on the dairy industry. And there's a few scattered around the country, obviously a lot located in Victoria. And when we look at them, there's no one thing that's common to any of them when we look at the whole community. So here, we're not looking just at the dairy industry component. We're looking at what's the community in which that industry is operating. And we see huge differences. So, for example, we've got some dairy communities where there's really high livability. So I'll call out some of the really happy ones. And that is, if we look at places like Campaspe, Corangamite, Moyne, Warrnambool, we've got more than 85% of people in those local government areas, all of which have a pretty decent dependence on the dairy industry, who say that they would recommend their community to other people as a good place to live. And that's a really big indicator of livability, because it's one thing to say you're willing to live in a community. It's another thing to say you'd go out and say to someone else, yeah, I really think you should come and live here. So there are examples of our sort of communities where it's fantastic. And while it would be lovely to say that's totally because of the dairy industry, that's not the case. There's hundreds of factors that affect the livability of communities. What the dairy industry is doing will be one amongst those hundreds of factors, because you've got lots of other industries operating, you've got lots of long history in those communities, all of which intersect to produce their livability. We do have other communities where it's only about 2/3 of people who say they'd recommend it to other people as a good place to live, some of our dairy communities. And that has really big implications for the dairy industry, because in the communities where they're a bit less livable, you're going to find it harder to recruit a workforce to live in that community. It's going to be harder to convince people to stay. You might have higher turnover of employees, as will any other industry operating in that community. And from a dairy industry perspective, one of the big challenges is trying to figure out what can our industry members do to contribute positively to the wellbeing of the communities we operate in. So in the ones where the wellbeing's great, how can we help keep that really high? What are we doing that's helping contribute to that already? It might be that a lot of dairy farmers, make huge contributions to local community festivals, for example. Let's make sure we keep on helping them have the time and the ability and the energy to do that. In the ones where livability isn't so good, what role can the dairy industry play in contributing to helping improve livability, recognising that it can't be the sole entity responsible for trying to do that. It's always got to be a collaboration of lots of different groups and organisations that are working to improve the overall well-being and quality of life in a community. So it raises challenging questions, but yeah, I wish I could say, dairy communities are all one thing, but the reality is they're all really unique, and every dairy community you go to is a unique community.
For sure, for sure. I guess from a more general sort of perspective, are there any sorts of approaches? You mentioned collaboration between community and different individuals. Are there sort of any approaches that you've seen to work towards raising livability and well-being in communities?
Yeah, the sorts of things that tend to work is when you get a group of diverse people in the community who come together and all agree on some shared goals.
Mm-hmm.
So what we tend to see doesn't work to raise livability is when lots of different groups in a community each do their own thing but don't talk to each other.
Mm-hmm.
So, you might get, and they might all be fantastic initiatives that they're each doing, but if they're not working together on it, it doesn't tend to create that community-wide change or bring the whole community along. So it tends to need strong leadership, especially if you've got a community that historically has had some challenges with livability, because we do have rural communities like that where this isn't a recent thing. You may have a community where, and everyone, I won't name any, but you can think in your head, what's some rural communities where there's a bit of a reputation? Turning that around is a really challenging thing. So you also need to set some realistic goals. What are 2 or 3 things we can do to turn it around? And you need to assess what's actually the livability challenge here. In one community, it will be an issue around safety and crime, which needs a very different response to one where the concern is that actually we're all really nice people, but we don't talk to each other very much. We have, particularly in Victoria, with so many urban people making the tree change, you've got quite a few communities where lots of new people have arrived, but they haven't necessarily integrated into the local community or felt able to. And so there's not good social connections, and that may be reducing livability of your community. If that's the problem, you've got a very different strategy you need, which is about how do you help people get to know each other? How do you create some community events that bring people together and help them to start feeling we're actually all part of this community together and we can work together for it? So that diagnosis bit is really, really important to do. Because we sometimes see people go, to improve livability, here's a list of the things I need to do. And it may be a great list, but it might not be the right list for your community. So you need to get to that diagnosis stage. What's going on in this community and what do we need to do? And how can we bring a lot of different voices and people together to collectively work on it? And the dairy industry would be one of those. Mm-hmm. So, and ideally working with others to help contribute to it.
Yeah, for sure. That makes sense to really kind of understand what it is that your community needs in order to kind of level up in terms of livability and well-being. Mm. Because you don't want to be solving the wrong problems, I suppose.
Absolutely.
So a lot of your work also deals with resilience. And I'm wondering if you could just kind of explain what is farmer resilience? What factors make a farmer resilient?
Yeah, really good question. So first of all, when we talk resilience, similar to well-being, we throw these words around, don't we? And well-being and resilience are they've become these words that almost mean nothing a lot of the time because they're being used so often. So let's start with resilience by defining it a little bit, because we need to get to something we can actually concretely measure. And we have been finding recently when we go and talk to people about resilience, they're a little over the R word. So it's almost become a little bit of a swear word, because it's just everyone's saying, we're going to invest for resilience, but no one's quite sure what we mean. So a resilient person or a resilient business is a personal business that's able to cope with really challenging times when they happen. And it doesn't mean that you experience no impacts from that challenge. It means that you can cope with it and you can recover your quality of life or your well-being or your business performance within a reasonably short time of the challenge happening. So, take drought as an example. To be resilient to drought, ideally you want to have strategies in place that mean that when the drought's happening, you can cope pretty well. You might experience a bit of it's going to be hard. You're going to have days where you're finding it challenging, but in general, you've got a strategy where I can get through to the end of this and I can get back to things being pretty good. But resilience also goes well beyond that, because to be resilient, we don't just want to cope when something's happening. We want to put in place strategies that let us adapt our lives or our business so that the impacts of that event are going to be less the next time it happens. So for drought resilience, ideally, We've actually done some planning beforehand or in a drought or after a drought, or often now there's no time between events. So we talk about adaptation as something we do all of the time. And we say, how can I change the way I'm actually running my farm or managing my life so that when the next drought happens, it's got a less negative impact on the farm or on our household? And that might involve making some pretty profound changes to your farm enterprise or to a whole range of aspects of your household. So when we talk about resilience, we're talking about everything from having the resources to cope when a bad thing's happening to putting in place these long-term strategies to adapt so that you reduce the impact in the future. And there's lots of stuff that makes us more resilient. So I might just briefly talk about what makes a person resilient and what makes a business resilient, because they intersect a bit. And when we're thinking about farmers, to be resilient, you both need to think about personal resilience of the farmer or the farmers that are managing that farm and of the farm business. And they're so interlinked, it's really hard to separate them. And one of the hard things people find with resilience is that often you'll get a lot of people talking about just a person's resilience and not linking it to the business that they're operating. A farmer doesn't have that luxury. They've got to think about both simultaneously. So when we talk about building farmer resilience, we need that intersection of how can you look after your own resilience and how does that then link to the resilience of your business? So if you're an individual person, to be resilient, ideally you need to have some good access to a few different types of what we call resilience resources. And that's things like the obvious one, which is financial resilience. You know, in an ideal world, which frankly doesn't happen all that often, so bear in mind I'm talking about the ideal here. In an ideal world, a person who is resilient will have access to a wonderful buffer of financial savings that they can use and draw on in challenging times. Now, that may not be in the form of a savings account that has a huge amount of money in it. It might be in the form of a debt facility with the bank, which means you have an agreement that you can go into a certain amount of debt during a challenging time. It might be investments that you can liquidate if you have to. But that financial buffer is actually a really important resilience component, which sadly in Australia we're seeing less and less people having with the cost of living crisis at the moment. So that is a real challenge. Unfortunately, we're seeing in recent years a lot of people doing things like having to reduce their insurance coverage because financially they're really stressed, or they might once have had a 3-month savings buffer for their income. Now it's down to 2 weeks. So thinking about what you can realistically do to have that financial buffer. But that's just one of the resilience resources. We often focus so much on financial resources that we forget about the others that are critically important. And they're your social networks. People forget or aren't often very aware that your social connections are a critical resource for resilience. So when challenging times happen, what's one of the first things a lot of people do? It is
Call a friend.
Yeah, call a friend, talk to other people in your household. Now, admittedly, not all farmers do that because farmers have been taught often that they need to cope with everything themselves and not necessarily involve other people. And even in recent years, when we've been trying to get a lot of really positive messages out to the farming community that say, if times are difficult, you should be able to talk to someone else. Don't feel afraid to talk. It's okay to talk about when you're feeling like you need help. It's okay to reach out for help. Those messages are sort of getting through, but we have found when we talk to farmers that they've gotten through in one direction only. Farmers are so used to being the ones that take care of everything that they say, oh yeah, I absolutely would tell a mate that they should reach out to me for help. And we're like, what if you needed the help? No, oh no, I'm the one that helps people.
Right.
So this is a real challenge for farmers, and it's a really challenging skill to learn for your resilience. Is a part of being really resilient is actually knowing when you need to reach out for help and being willing to accept help from others. And that's something where I think we have a way to go for a lot of farmers because historically they haven't been encouraged to do that. It's really hard to change that mindset when everything you've learned is that I need to be stoic, I need to deal with stuff myself, I need to help others. We've very much got that strong culture of farmers help other people in need, but not that culture of, hey, I think I might actually need to reach out for help. And ideally, you want people to reach out for help early before things get too bad. And when I say reaching out for help, it's not just reaching out for help to, talk about mental health issues. It's reaching out for help to ask someone if they can help with some stock adjustment earlier in the drought. That's a big one, I know. And a few people will listen to this and go, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. But we've actually done a couple studies where we asked people, well, how early did you start putting in plans for where your stock would go early in a period of reduced rainfall, where you weren't even sure yet if this was going to be a full-on drought? And the earlier you had those conversations and sort of looked at what your options were, whether you're doing it as a business transaction, whether you're doing sort of arrangements with farmers who might be, a little distance away and have had some better rainfall, the better you tended to go. So even things like that, reaching out practically and having conversations in your social networks can really help your resilience through a challenging time, as well as reaching out to have hard conversations when you are struggling with your mental health.
You made a good point, especially the complexities of being a farmer, having both that professional and personal, that business and individual sort of sides coming together. And I mean, that's a lot riding on somebody's shoulders. You mentioned sort of mitigating against environmental incidents or, that sort of on-farm day-to-day. What about things like reaching out to the community or like a men's shed or just having a regular sort of connection in that? Is that sort of things that can help in that respect?
It can, but we also need to be really careful to identify the things that work for each individual person.
For sure.
So for some people, the men's shed's great, but when you're under a lot of stress in the middle of a drought, it might actually feel like an added burden. So one of the things we see sometimes is, in terms of resilience, we get worried when we see people cut back on their normal social interaction. So, and that's when we know resilience is really falling. And it might mean that, for example, people are struggling because they can't afford to put fuel in the vehicle to go into town for dinner, or they can't afford to pay for the dinner. Or it might mean that mentally they're not in a space where they're feeling able to talk to people. And we also know that trying to keep up your contact with social networks, whatever form they take. It might be keeping up your membership of the sports team. It might be going to the pub and catching up with some mates. It might be going to that family gathering. It could be a whole range of things. That is incredibly protective of your resilience and predicts good outcomes. So one of the best interventions we can do is to say, okay, how can we help people maintain their social connections during hard times while not making that be an extra burden they have to do? So we need to make sure it's affordable. We need to make sure it fits with what's going to work for that person. So building the skills in yourself to know, hang on, there's a few signs here that I'm kind of withdrawing and things are going a bit wrong. I need to reach out. That's actually a really hard skill to learn, and it takes practice and repetition like any other skill. And it also takes practice to sort of know how to gently encourage other people around you who you might see going into that space. And it's really important for all those reasons we talked about, that when you have those social networks, it also helps you access pragmatic, practical help as well as support your mental health. We also, for resilience in people, we talk about their psychological resilience resources even beyond social networks. And that's stuff like, are you in the headspace where you can make good decisions? So, technically we talk about terms like self-efficacy and locus of control and mastery. But broadly speaking, are you feeling like you actually can make the decisions you need to achieve good outcomes for your future? That's a really important psychological resilience resource. And again, it's one that it takes a bit of skill to build up. And what we tend to see is that by the time you're an older farmer, you've built that because you've gone through so many challenging times that you've figured out that, hey, actually, I do make it out the other end. But particularly when you support our younger farmers, because they won't have experienced these challenges, and it feels pretty awful the first few times you go through them, because until you get through the other side, you're not confident you're going to make it there. So there's a lot we can do in that space to help get sharing of knowledge and learning between the older generation of farmers who've kind of seen so many challenges, you can't even describe them, and help them share some of that knowledge with younger farmers so they can build those psychological resources that are about what we call sort of hardiness and stoicism, and going, okay, yeah, actually I can make it through this. Feeling confident that you can make it through it actually helps you put in place the actions that help you get through a hard time.
Right.
So that's a challenging one, but one that I think we can do a lot to build. So
yeah, and it almost sounds like, as a practical thought process, seeing, scanning yourself and thinking, okay, I don't want to go to this. What are the reasons that I don't want to go out to this social event? And maybe using that as a personal indicator, possibly, where you're at.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot of things we can do. And when we talk about business resilience, it's interesting. We often get people coming and asking us, based on our research, what's the things that farmers should do to be resilient to a particular event? And they always really hate our answer, which is there's no one thing. It depends on the farmer. Every farmer needs their own plan for what works for their household and their farm business, for what's their resilience strategies. So what really works to be a resilient business is to have that active thinking about, how am I going to deal with the next challenge? What do I need to put in place? And to feel free to put in place some pretty creative solutions. Sometimes we've found that farmers feel really constrained. They feel they should do one thing to be resilient. So I'm just going to try and think of a couple examples we've had. I was in a workshop with some farmers a couple of years back where we asked them, what's actually helped you with getting through the multiple challenging events you've had? Because one of the biggest issues with resilience we're seeing at the moment is that farmers are really used to preparing for being hit with 2 or 3 really challenging things in a given year or couple of years. Now we're kind of needing them to up the ante a bit. They're often being hit with 4 or 5 or 6 big challenges. And it's not just your drought and your floods. They're intersecting with a crash in your market price for the key commodity you're producing. And that might be intersecting with a risk of a pest or a disease threat that suddenly comes in, or might be a mouse plague. And then you might get a global pandemic or a supply chain breakdown. So they're needing to be able to manage all of those. And the people who come through successfully tend to be the ones who have in place a plan for how they're going to deal with that. But it's not just a plan that you write, you stick on a shelf and you never look at. It's a living plan that gets adapted and changed day to day as you're experiencing change in your farm business. So quite often we used to ask farmers, do you have a written plan for the future of your farm business? And increasingly now we don't worry about that. We just say, do you have a plan that you're actively discussing with others and that you're regularly updating? Because that's actually what tends to work well. If you're sort of going, okay, I've seen this and this happen. They've never happened before, but maybe we need to change what we're going to do to this to help us cope with that a bit better. So we've seen farmers, for example, in a lot of our cropping regions who are completely changing what their plans are for if there's poor rain in wintertime, because we've had failure of winter rainfall happen with some of our recent droughts. And that hadn't necessarily happened for a lot of them before in living memory. But they've started adapting their plans and thinking about really creative ways they can change their cropping cycles to actually still figure out a good financial future for their farm. That's some pretty challenging stuff when you think about it. It's huge.
It's huge.
But we're also seeing a lot of farmers who are thinking beyond their farm. So for some farmers, their drought strategy is not, here's how I'm going to make sure I can keep producing lots of stuff on my farm. It's, here's where I'm going to earn income off the farm. That means that I can scale back what we're doing on the farm during the drought, and I can be ready to scale it back up again after the drought. So that's equally valid as a strategy. But we tend to see some farmers don't want to talk about that, or the fact that they've actually got these really amazing active resilience planning strategies where, they might have actually planned, okay, we're going to have one of us being the main farm manager in the household and the other person earning a steady income off farm. We might have set up an agricultural contracting business that can work up to 1,000 kilometres from home, so that when things are going bad where our farm actually is, we can still be contracting a distance away and getting an income stream from that, and that's going to keep us going. They're all really valid resilience strategies. But we often don't recognise or reward people who are putting in place these amazingly creative, awesome strategies for keeping not just a viable farm business, but a viable household, and contributing to their community more generally. So the more we can do to encourage people to share all these hundreds of strategies they put in place, the better.
And that's that creative aspect, and being able to kind of, diversify your income and also come out on top, possibly from going through a difficult time.
Yeah. And sometimes the barrier to doing that is people say, but a good farmer's one who earns all their money from the farm. That's the sort of thinking that can unfortunately act as a barrier to you building resilience, because that might not be the right thing for you. The right thing for you might be, I'm actually going to happily have a dedicated portion of my household income that we aim to earn off farm, so that we can maintain a successful farm. But during drought years, we're not stressing about having to pay massive feed costs and try and keep up a lot of production. We're actually scaling back. We, might really reduce what we're doing for a couple of years, and then we come back in. But we're able to stay financially viable through the money we're getting from other sources.
Yeah, for sure. It's about keeping going forward. And, that's, yeah.
Yeah. And
so, go ahead.
Yeah. I was going to say, we also, when we look at sort of stepping it up from the farmer to the community, we've got this similar thing in that we're seeing communities asking that same question. How can we be resilient to lots of different challenges? And again, sometimes they're all being given the same answers, but every community can have its own sort of unique way of being resilient. Some communities, they say, okay, let's get lots of people from have lots of different jobs, so that when one industry is struggling, there's always income from another one. That's a great resilience strategy for a community, but it can also be really different to that. It can be, how can we make sure that people have enough of that we sort of support each other in the community enough that we can all get through a downtime together. And we know that there'll be those times. And during the times where we've got, say, a tourism industry that's struggling for a few months, what are the positive things we can do during that time that help this community come together and support each other? There's a whole range of strategies that can be put in place.
For sure. And I mean, I think what you're saying too is every community is different, and they have their own complex, and, farm is different with their own complex set of problems, issues, opportunities. And so it is about, you can't have that quick fix, one template to fix all, but adaptation seems, to be kind of a similar theme.
Yeah, adaptation. And I do think the one thing that's really challenging is that sometimes people are having to make really big decisions about their lives. So it's easy for me to talk about small strategies we put in place to improve our coping, but we also need to think, what's the point at which you would say it's not viable to farm any longer? That's a question that almost feels bad to say it out loud, and a lot of farmers really struggle when they do get to that point. We had one study we did which used Regional Wellbeing survey data, where we actually tracked farmers who had made the decision to exit farming. And something that's almost never talked about. It's like we think in our heads, if you exit farming, it's viewed as almost a failure. And people are very reluctant to talk about it. Whereas in any other job, it's common for people to change careers. It's common for them to change jobs. It's not viewed as a failure, or as you're not expected to have to stay in this one career your entire life. The expectations we put on farmers with this sort of thinking is really unrealistic. What we did find was that amongst farmers who exited farming, when we surveyed them, within 3 years of leaving farming, over 80% said it was the best decision they'd ever made.
Right.
Because whatever reasons they left farming for were good reasons. And so we even need to encourage farmers to think about, to be resilient, you may need to make a decision to make a fundamental change to your farm enterprise. And that may even involve saying, I don't actually feel like I want to be in farming any longer. Thousands of people have actually made that decision in the last few decades. And the majority of them have had fantastic lives post-farming, often still working in agriculture, just in a different way, but maybe working in another industry in their community. So that's where what we call transformation in resilience, where you make a transformative decision that fundamentally changes your life in order to protect your well-being and your quality of life. So when we think resilience, we also have to think about what's our goal with resilience. Is the goal that we must stay in farming or in dairy farming, or is the goal that we want to make sure people have good well-being and quality of life? For me, it's the latter. We want to make sure people have good well-being and quality of life. And if that means you leave farming and someone else comes in, takes over your farm and does great things with it, fantastic. That's actually a great outcome. But I'm sure there'll be some people listening who are like, oh, that's going a bit far. We don't talk like that. And that's one of the challenges, is to encourage people to feel okay to think those thoughts and to have those conversations if that's where they're at and that's what they need to do.
And like you said earlier, it really is resilience is an individual process.
Yeah.
So what's next for the Wellbeing Project? Do you have more research in the works, or are there kind of projects coming out of it, or what's next?
Yeah, we have lots of work going on out of all of our wellbeing work. One of the projects we're really excited about is the project that we're starting up, funded by the Gardiner Foundation. So that's called Building Wellbeing into Regional Decision Making. And that actually taps into a lot of what we've just been talking about. The idea is that we want to use the sort of data and knowledge that we've built up to better support local leaders in rural communities. They're often asked to really support their communities through these fundamentally challenging processes. But they often still find they really lack the information they need to do that. And they also sometimes find it really hard because people keep asking them to make decisions based on the economy, but they're not given skills and capacity to think about that broader wellbeing piece. How do I support the wellbeing of my community? So this new project, we're going to be building a wellbeing resource hub where local rural leaders can go and can actually say, hey, if I want to actually look at wellbeing, what should I be looking at? And they can easily find some information about the sorts of indicators you might want to look at in your community. We'll also be developing resources for leaders about how do you build this idea of wellbeing and considering wellbeing into decision-making and into how you lead in your community. So that's one of the exciting projects we've got. We're doing a lot of work still into working out how we can better measure and track resilience. And we also do a lot of advocacy work. So at the moment, some of the things we're doing is advocating around what does a rural community need to be resilient. And when we step up to that level, there's some really obvious things that we often don't think about. So we tend to talk about resilience of communities and think about, are they all prepared for the next natural disaster, and so that we can minimise impact to buildings and roads. And that's absolutely important. Just as important is thinking about, do we have enough access to health services on a day-to-day basis? Do we have enough tradies who are actually available in our community to meet the demand for just maintaining buildings and electricity and plumbing, and to be available to put in place new infrastructure we might be putting in place to be more resilient to drought, for example, or to heat waves? If you don't have the tradies who can do the work, we're actually going to struggle to put in place your resilience strategies, some of those practical things. So I was talking to some farmers a few weeks ago who said, we're planning to put in some really good feed pads, but we've been waiting 6 months for a tradie to be available to help us set up the feed pads on our property. So
too long.
Some of those enabling things, that's where we're struggling in a lot of rural communities. So some common challenges are that ability to access services and infrastructure that you need to be resilient. Another common one is telecommunications. How many people say, I've got this great idea for a business I could run from my home, but I don't have good enough internet access to be able to run the home business that I need to run, to have that as an extra income stream on top of my farming income. So they're the sorts of things that, through projects like the Gardiner project, we want people to be able to access information so they can actually go and lobby and say, actually, in our community, we've got 60% of people saying they can't get in to see a GP within 5 days. That's a fundamental wellbeing and resilience problem. And we want to be able to make sure we continue to help with getting people the information they can use to advocate for their community, and to help them identify where are the pain points for their community. What are the things that are acting as barriers to building resilience and building your ability to maintain good wellbeing over time.
Yeah, and you can have those conversations with people, your locals on the street about that, but actually having data that backs that up is really helpful.
It is, yeah. And we need to, I often go into communities and I'm telling them what they already know.
Yeah.
But I'm often putting it in a way that they can then use in funding applications, in advocating to state governments and to the Australian government, even in just getting a shared understanding, because occasionally we are finding out things that communities aren't aware of or haven't sort of consciously looked at in their community. It might be something that is just such a part of everyday life, they never stop and think, hang on, that's actually something we should look at in a bit more detail. So we also do a bit of that.
Yeah, for sure. I know I could certainly deal with a few more tradies in my area. So, but yeah, that's all. Jacki, it's been wonderful speaking to you today. I really appreciate you taking the time to jump on Dairy Pod and, chat about this stuff. Really appreciate it.
Excellent. Thanks so much for having me on.
Thank you for joining today's Dairy Pod episode. We hope you found it enjoyable and insightful. For more information, check out the episode notes. You can stay up to date by following Dairy Pod on your favourite podcast platform. To get in touch, visit dairyaustralia.com.au. Until next time, take care.